So now it's time to introduce our guest, Dan Hinckley, who is a name many of us know. I first went to his sort of homeland of the Pacific Northwest in 1996, I think, courtesy of a lecture organised by Horticulture magazine. I didn't meet Dan then, but his name was on everyone's lips. I rather fell in love with the area. I mean, the Pacific Northwest is an incredible area scenically, and in terms of its very rich garden culture. Been quite a few times over the years. Every time you go over, there seems to be the sort of latest episode in the Dan Hinckley and Heronswood story. And so it's that I'd like to sort of unpack this evening, talking to Dan about his career, and then we'll segue into Dan just giving us a short visual presentation of what he's been up to over the years. Now, Dan, you have a reputation as a plantsman who's not just grown an incredible range of plants, many of them very unfamiliar, but also seen a lot of these things in the wild. How did you get going? How did you start out?
Planting a gourd seed with my dad. It was, I think I planted it a foot deep and it never germinated, but I do still remember that process of taking the seed and planting it. And I suppose I was 3 or 4 years old, but I can still almost, as if it was yesterday, remembering the process. Remembering morning glories on the fence around the house that I grew up in northern Michigan, being quite entranced by those. And then later, maybe 4 or 5, taking orange pips from my mom's kitchen and planting them, and then watching that miracle of germination. I was fully hooked. That's all I needed to watch those cotyledons lift out of the soil, and I became a student, and I still am.
So yeah, how did you end up running a nursery? I mean, that's the gap between planting seeds as a kid and doing it rather more seriously as a life mission.
Oh, you didn't want to focus in on my childhood.
Oh, we wanted to hear about your childhood. We want to know how you go from childhood to adulthood. There's a bit in the middle.
So yeah, all right. I thought we were just going to stick within the years before 7. No, I stayed fascinated by plants throughout my high school, and also started looking at plants in the wild while I was in high school. Got to know the local flora, but in particular the bogs, the flora of bogs around where I grew up. I went on to horticulture at Michigan State University and got my undergraduate degree in horticulture and horticultural education. As I thought I wanted to become a teacher, my parents were perplexed. They believed they would be taking care of me the rest of their lives, as they saw no future in growing plants. I did go ahead and get a job in teaching horticulture, and then moved out to the West Coast in the early 1980s, and lived in Washington State. Went on to get my master's at the University of Washington, and throughout those years, I was accumulating a large collection of plants. By the time Robert and I moved to Herrenswood in 1987, we had one small load of furniture and belongings and kitchen gear, and 7 truckloads of plants that we brought here that I had been carrying across the country and nurturing both in Eastern Washington and Western Washington while I was getting my master's. So I was well on my way to becoming a nurseryman, perhaps without really knowing that I was.
So when did you actually start the nursery? I mean, you were, and perhaps you could talk a little bit about the focus of those early nursery years.
In 1987, we were getting our feet on the ground here as the first piece of property that Robert and I had owned. ever in our lives.
Mm.
And I started the process of making my garden here at Heronswood. I'm speaking from Heronswood today, so I'll refer to being at Heronswood in the event that it confuses people. And I also erected my first greenhouse. It was a family reunion. All of Robert's brother-in-laws came for a reunion here, and they helped us erect and electrify and dig the water main in one day, putting up a greenhouse. And so it really had been a dream to have a nursery, but in the process of getting that off the ground, I continued to teach at a local community college. Robert continued to practice as an architect in downtown Seattle. And so for the next 6 years, a very chaotic life for us as we got the nursery off the ground, but continued to each carry on with full-time jobs. And we were commuting by ferry to our jobs as well. So that added new dimension to it all. We put our first list out, Noel, in 1989, and it was just the correct time. The timing was perfect. In the late 80s and early 90s, as many of us remember, both in Europe as well as in the United States, the perennial craze was close to insanity. People were getting into gardening in a really big way, and wanted the newest and the best and the rarest to outgarden other people with. And we just happened to be there at that time, and we rode that crest in a most amazing and exciting time ever. It was also a pretty exhausting time for both of us as we were building the nursery and having people around us 7 days a week, and also carrying on 2 full-time jobs.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned your first list. Now, somewhere I have some old catalogues of yours, and I think these are often, a lot of people have these old Herrenswood catalogues are sort of carefully placed on bookshelves. They were quite something, those catalogues, incredibly informative and also very entertaining. I mean, do you think the catalogue was perhaps a major part of the nursery's appeal?
Well, I think it was. You know, we tried to create a dream, or provide an experience for people who subscribe to the catalog. And Robert was always fond of saying we weren't selling plants, we were selling dreams of gardens through those descriptions and through the introductions to each section. So I think it grabbed the imagination of a lot of gardeners and across North America, in Canada, also Europe, and even Asia is where we were selling plants. So we had no internet during those times. No. And we weren't producing a glossy catalog with photos, which was never our MO. So in 100 words or less, I had to describe a plant in a way that might engage people, and how to perhaps grow the plant and utilize it to its best advantage. It was a good exercise for me, and it was also a tremendous amount of work writing that many descriptions.
I can imagine. Yes.
Every autumn, it was 3 months of production time.
My God, yeah. No, it was very impressive. They're still works of reference, really, I think, those catalogues. And then when were you able to start traveling, looking at plants in the wild?
My first trip was in 1988, 88. Even though, with that said, I've been traveling my whole life, and after I was out of college, first years out of college, I was traveling. I spent a good amount of time in Europe and then in Japan, and looking at plants and gardens was always, of course, part of that. It wasn't until 1988 that I took my first real collecting trip into Japan, and was able at that point to collect seeds in the wild. And then fast forward until 1993, when while in South Korea on my first extended month or 6 weeks long trip to South Korea in order to collect seed, I ran into our mutual friends, Blevin and Sue Wynne-Jones, just by complete serendipity. Alongside a country road. A car stopped and rolled down their window and asked me in a Welsh accent so heavy I thought he was talking to me in Slovenian, asking me for directions. So that created a lifelong relationship, that moment. And from that point on, it snowballed into once, twice, 3 times a year being in the field, looking at plants.
Right. Yes. Yes. And what do you feel that personally you can, or we can all learn in terms of looking at plants in the wild, in terms of gardening?
Yeah. Well, how many days do we have to talk about that? In a nutshell, looking at a plant in the wild has been the most informative process for me as a gardener. Immediately I know where that plant wants to grow in its rightful place. In parentheses, not always grows the best as it would in nature, and oftentimes grows better in a garden setting than what you see it growing in its native haunts. That aside, making me a better gardener, it's made me so much hyper aware of the intricacies, the majesties, the magic of the natural world, the interconnectedness of it all, what pollinates this, what distributes that, what is it used by the people that have been living with it, cultivating it, harvesting it for millennia, and understanding that the human condition is part and parcel to life on Earth, more than many of us want to realize. We somehow have elected ourselves as being the comptroller rather than being part and parcel to it. And doing what I've done, it's made me realize that I am just another bumblebee in the process.
A nice image, down as bumblebee. And that point you made about the fact that sometimes you can grow plants in the garden considerably better than you see them in the wild. I sort of come to the conclusion, really, that very often when you see plants growing in the wild, you're actually seeing them growing in the worst conditions they can tolerate. Because what you're seeing is actually the outcomes of competition. I mean, just having seen Perovskia growing in Pakistan and Kyrgyzstan, incredibly inhospitable environments, you never see it growing anywhere nice because it's outcompeted by other stuff. That for me has actually been an important lesson. So as I said, back to the Pacific Northwest, my various visits there, I know what you mean about gardening in the 90s was a cult. Particularly all these people who'd come up from California, and they were, the archetypal sort of West Coast people, and on the one hand, you had this gardening as status symbol. I mean, you referred to people trying to out-garden each other. You definitely had a sense of that. But also a lot of really good community stuff. I mean, planting up the Hell Strip and that much more sort of community outreach side was rather wonderful as well. And various people I stayed with or who hosted me while I was lecturing would, they'd be off volunteering or working or whatever at Heronswood, and people who worked at Heronswood were referred to as Heronistas, I seem to remember. And I never got there during the glory days. I think I tended to stay in Oregon. But the reputation of Heronswood was it was kind of way beyond any British nursery had a reputation in my lifetime. It was a center of a cult, and Dan was the high priest. And as I said, I never got a continuous story. I just got these snippets from whenever I would either go there or have a detailed email from somebody. And then, horror of horrors, you sold the business to George Ball of Ball Seeds, who is a sort of a big Pennsylvania-based essentially seed company, a corporation. And there was sort of wailing and gnashing of teeth and cries of heresy and how could he do it and all the rest of it. I think you've already given us some idea of just how much incredibly hard work the nursery was and how it took over your life. But what was really behind your decision to sell the nursery?
Well, you just referred to it somewhat. One, this, me being the high priest of the horticultural community in the Pacific Northwest or beyond, I never ever had that sense of myself. One.
You're very modest, Andy.
Oh no, that is. I mean, that may sound like modesty, but that is that is complete and utter truth. I mean, you're surrounded by your own work. You're surrounded by the people that you're having to manage, and you're surrounded by the pressure to put out something new and a good product every year. And you do hear your critics, and you take your critics to heart, and you take your competitors, sour grapes to heart, but you don't necessarily take or believe your own press. And we got a lot of press, but I always felt rather insecure, to be quite honest. At Heronswood, we were working. As I've already mentioned, we were working 7 days a week. And just to give you an idea, Robert and I commuted by ferry, 35 minutes each way to work, 35, 40 minutes home. That's not to mention the waiting time at the ferry terminals. And during even the commute times, we were writing plant labels. I was writing descriptions. We were doing invoices. We were blah, blah, blah. And all of the things that are associated with it. And that was just on our commute. And then getting up at 4:30 in the morning before I left to do more things for the nursery, and then getting home at night and finishing up work until 9, 10 o'clock before it all started. Again, Robert and I would see each other at the coffee maker in the morning. Excuse me. So Heronswood, in 16, 17 years of doing this, became an enormously heavy weight, being surrounded by employees and visitors to the garden 7 days a week, looking out our breakfast window on an early Sunday morning, having people you don't know looking through the window while we're standing in our underwear trying to have a early cup of coffee. So it was much more of a yoke than people realize. Add to that, someone arrived at perhaps one of those days that we were most exhausted and most frustrated, with a big bag of, paper bag full of money, saying, "Hey, let me take this over for you. Let me organize it for you. Let me run it for you, and you take some of the chips off the table." Well, yes, and in the words of Stephen Sondheim in Sunday at the Park. He said, "I chose and my world was shaken. So what? The choice may have been mistaken. The choosing was not." And that really speaks loudly to me. We made obviously a wrong choice with who we sold it to, but making the decision to sell, no. It was.
Well appreciate. Yeah. Because I mean, it didn't. The Ball Company didn't make a success of it, did they?
Yeah, and I want to make sure that people understand the Ball Company and Burpee are of the same family, but not the same organization. So
okay, yeah.
George Ball was, a scion of the grandfather who made all of his money in the Ball Company, but he chose to lose it all under his company. So anyway, they did not. No due diligence on our part, just simply believing that company was big, sophisticated, knowledgeable enough to take it and run with it, and we were going to be the stewards of it going forward. So it all feels, quite honestly, I mean, I understand your need to bring it up, but any dwelling on that time has long drifted under a bridge
Many
that we're
bridges.
standing on.
So yeah. Freeing yourself of the nursery, what did that enable you to do?
Freeing ourselves from the nursery didn't really allow us.
So you must have had a new lease of life. So
new lease on life, and that year I picked up playing piano again.
Oh, great!
Taking piano lessons that I hadn't for years and years, and continued on taking piano lessons. I started going to a gym on a very regular basis, and I started traveling more. I started looking at plants more on behalf of the nursery. So my most productive times up until they Burpee closed the nursery in 2012, my most productive times were between the year 2000 and 2006 when they shuttered it. So that sale did allow me to get out into the field a lot more than I have been able to.
Yeah. Now, one of the sort of gossip snippets I sort of picked up on my travels, you had a relationship with Martha Stewart, which sounded actually a positive one. Now, for those of you who have either forgotten or don't know who Martha Stewart is, how do you begin to describe Martha Stewart? Martha Stewart was a true phenomenon. She was a garden guru, a cookery guru, a interior decor guru. She was the guru of all gurus, and she had an empire. And particularly for aspirational Americans, if you wanted to know how to cook the perfect Thanksgiving dinner in the room painted in the perfect colors and with a flower arrangement and a garden and all the rest of it, you went to Martha Stewart. You bought one of Martha Stewart's magazines. And I remember my trips round about the late 90s, early 2000s. Amongst the sort of garden cognoscenti, she was a kind of joke. It was just did the dinner tables of the kind of, the liberal folk of the Pacific Northwest or the East Coast were, full of Martha Stewart jokes. And then you started doing some work for her. I remember you describing to me, or somebody describing to me, how this helicopter was circling and the pilot was wanting somewhere to land, and the helicopter came down and out came Martha Stewart. And the word on the block was that she respected you in the way that she didn't necessarily respect everyone she had dealings with. And I think you got on with her quite well, didn't you? Because she certainly had some very good people working for her. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Martha?
Yes, I really felt truly blessed, and I still continue to feel very blessed to know her, because she is one of a kind, and as many jokes that might circle around her, or envious comments of she can't possibly do it all. I can tell you from personal experience that if I were to get up at her home, and where I was oftentimes a guest, it would be Martha out on the terrace, sweeping the terrace before there was ever any activity in the house. She was up doing it. I can recall one morning in the Hamptons. We were staying at her home in the Hamptons. She was putting on a dinner party that night for 20, and it happened to be a dinner party in my honor. Isn't that really nice? And I staggered down into the kitchen. She was making a pastry for the dessert for that evening in the kitchen. And she was just finishing it up at 5 a.m. She looked at me and she said, okay, my part of the dinner is over, and now I get to enjoy the day. What do you want to do? So that was Martha. And by the way, the pastry was to perfection. So
I bet it was. Yes.
If anyone thinks they're looking at smoke and mirrors with Martha Stewart, I can tell you, she is a very genuine, incredibly curious woman who wants to know, wants to experience, and does it. So I feel, again, I feel pretty perplexed by why our paths intersected as they did, our friendship grew, but I'm very happy they did.
Great, yeah, and you're still friends.
We are indeed still friends.
Yeah,
we chat on a regular basis, and
that's nice.
she has not slowed down one.
No. Truly a phenomenon.
Just had her 80th birthday party on August 3rd. Good on her.
Yes, great, good. So for Heronswood itself as a garden, something of wilderness years, there were various attempts to sort of revive the dream by various of the starstruck folk of the region. And then there was effectively a rescue, rather extraordinarily, with the S Klallam people, which sounds very intriguing. Now, so effectively, Heronswood has been reborn. So how did that all come about?
Well, to recap real quickly, Burpee went into Chapter 11 only months after buying Heronswood. So it was within 6 months they had defaulted, and they were offering it back to us. Our brand image obviously had changed dramatically. We were not interested in taking it back. And then they immediately put it on the market at a pretty exorbitant price, and that price continued to drop for the next 6 years. Towards the end of that 6 years, I was approached by the CEO of the Port Gamble S Klallam, which is a small-ish Indian tribe just down the road, a mile away. That's where their tribal headquarters are, asking me in the event if they did acquire Heronswood Garden Nursery, if I would be willing to come back and help them bring it back to life. My response was, of course, I would be delighted to, as a volunteer, of course. And so hence they moved forward at auction and picked up the 15 acres that Heronswood had become for a very, very fair market price, and if not somewhat undervalued market price. So from that point on, as soon as the S Klallam had possession of the property, along with a lot of the volunteers, those same ones that had wanted to save the garden, we were in here starting to hack back 6 years of growth. And within a couple of years, they then asked me if I would take on the position of part-time director, which I agreed to, and then on to full-time director as a full-time employee with S Klallam. And that I did for 8 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And have just retired that position and
Right.
passed that directorship on to
Yes.
a very, very capable person. The garden has a master plan behind it now. Been adopted by the tribe. We are instituting the master plan. It's a very, very exciting process.
Fantastic. Yeah, yeah.
The garden has never looked better.
Wow.
And I'll just the momentum behind it is phenomenal.
Yeah. And how many of the S Klallam are actually involved in working there or training?
Well, excuse me, half of our staff.
Yeah.
Half of our staff are S Klallam, other half non-native.
Yeah.
And we also run a retraining program for S Klallam youth at risk.
Yeah.
So they come to work with us for 6 months as they're trying to get back on track over one thing or another. And some of those people have become our best employees. So
yeah, great, great.
It is. It's just one of the best outcomes that I ever would have imagined for this garden. It's been phenomenal. And so many levels.
No, and back in the day, no one could have predicted that. I mean, that's as you say, a truly wonderful outcome. I mean, really fantastic, and a huge credit to you, and I think all of the people who've been involved. So I think perhaps we should see what pictures you've got for us.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and share screen then, and go ahead and run through some of the.
Yes.
Here's Noel Kingsbury. I see. There we go. And you have to forgive me. It was you gave me the task of 20 minutes, Noel, and you should certainly know by now that it's impossible to talk about me in 20 minutes. It's being facetious. Here is a shot taken this morning. Certainly autumn is back in the air, and despite our horrible dryness that we're experiencing in the Pacific Northwest, the light, the coolness in the air is amongst us again, and a little bit of promise that we'll get through this drought that we're in, and carry on for another gardening calendar. So just a little bit about both gardens. Excuse my gravelly voice. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the air is just so dry here. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with where the heck I am, I grew up in Michigan, as Noel has already noted, and moved out to Washington State in 1980. So I've now been here 41 years. That makes me an almost native to our state of Washington. Do not look at that red on our state of Washington and believe that we're a red state, because we now have red states and blue states in our very united states. We are very blue, and thankfully so. I first moved to Eastern Washington, which is dry desert, and then moved to the Puget Sound Basin, which has the maritime influence. It's exceedingly different. You can see our state here, and that rib of the Cascade Range that comes down the middle of the state. Everything to the left is moist. Everything to the right is very, very dry. So Eastern Washington is high plateau and high desert. and averages maybe 11 to 15 inches of rain and precipitation a year. If you go out to the very far west coast, where I have Vampires noted, as that is the place that Forks exists, the fictional place of those bloodthirsty vampires that were popularized in a series of novels. We're looking at 13 feet of rain a year. So that gives you an idea of the climatic differences between this one chunk of land that we call Washington State. Seattle, slightly to the right of the Kitsap Peninsula, but the Kitsap Peninsula is where I live and have lived for all of these years after graduating from the University of Washington in 1983. It says, zeroing in on the Kitsap Peninsula, we've been talking about Heronswood. You can see where that is in relationship to Windcliff, my current garden where I live, with my partner, now husband, Robert Jones. The Olympic Peninsula off to our west. The Olympic Peninsula is where the Olympic National Park is, which is the largest national park in the lower 48 states. So right in our doorstep, some of the best hiking, the most magnificent country in all of North America. Feel very blessed to live so close by. But the Kitsap Peninsula is surrounded by salt water, and it's essentially a glacial moraine of rocky, sandy soil left behind after the last glacial epoch. So in 1987, already noted, Robert and I drove into the property we had just signed on and took possession of the property on September 1st, 1987. So that's 41 years ago yesterday. Is that true? No, it's not true. 44 years ago yesterday. And a heron flew from the pond right near the gate. We opened that, swung that gate open. The gate fell off the hinge. The money pit began, but a heron, startled, flew off from the pond. And we named the property Heronswood at that instant as we were settling into our house. This ultimately ended in only a short amount of time, with a lot of work involved, plus a contingent of Heronistas that we called our employees, our beloved Heronistas, which is a very tight family, some of whom are still working now at present day Heronswood. We created Heronswood Nursery simultaneously with creating the garden. The garden fed the nursery fed the garden. And so we had, you can see the greenhouses here. We did mail order across to all 50 states and also Europe, as well as bits and pieces of Asia that were into horticulture, especially Japan. And these were all marketed through this series of catalogs that Noel has already made mention of. That we have a few complete collections of these at the garden in our library, and all written, no pictures, essays. The 2000 one on the right in the middle row, 2000 edition, had about 50 essays from huge assortment of garden luminaries, from Rosemary Very and Penelope Hobhouse, Roy Lancaster, J.C. Ralston. So, you know, it was, it's still a collectible copy, and if you can get your hands on it, there's some really beautiful original essays in that particular edition. So I don't have time to take you on a full tour of Heronswood. A little bit of before and after pictures. This would be in the early 1990s with Alan Hansen, one of our early employees, planting Carpinus in the position of our very first greenhouse that we had built in 1987 with, I've already said, a family reunion. My brothers-in-laws or is it brother-in-law's? Never certain, but here he is planting Carpinus, Betulus fastigiata. We created this hedge with a little bit of input from Rosemary Very and Helen Dillon that happened to be here a night. Gosh, I can't even tell you if Noel Kingsbury wasn't here that evening. A huge number of people that came for an evening of frivolity and conversation, and we went out with flashlights afterwards, perhaps a little bit too much wine involved, and tied the hedges together, or came up with the idea of what we might do. And this is the outcome of that. So I never look at the hedge, which is now rather iconic for Herrenswood, without thinking of that evening of all those great horticultural heroes of mine that did help us formulate in one way or another what we might do with that particular piece of land. I am looking at it right outside my office window right now, and it's just one part of Herrenswood. The potager that Robert and I ate from for 15 years was ultimately constructed to the west, and certainly there's no question that the various and sundry potagers that we saw in Europe, especially in the UK, didn't guide us down this. We built this to eat from, and eat organically, and of course eat fresh. Looking at it now, it is no longer a potager, but the structure of it remains intact, the hedges remain intact, and this has become one of the more popular places for people to become married, as we are a wedding venue at Heronswood. One of our sources of income at Heronswood Garden, now owned by the Port Gamble S Klallam. We built the arbor after a flight in time in England. Robert sketched this hedge, he sketched this structure to replace a hedge in the back of our house after visiting Woodland Garden, not far from Blethen and Sioux, and loosely based on the structures that were at Woodland. We still have the cocktail napkin that he sketched this on the plane ride on the way home. And this has become rebuilt now since the S Klallam have taken possession. It has become a very popular place in the garden, surrounded by plantings that hopefully hold the seasons together as people visit throughout the year. The Woodland Garden, one of the areas that perhaps beckon the most visitors. It was the Woodland Garden that Herrenswood really became known for, I think, over the years, a place that I could grow many of my collected plants from similar climates worldwide. The overstory second growth Douglas fir, mostly Douglas fir with a few grand fir and cedars mixed in. This is the driveway going down through the Woodland Garden, and the Woodland Garden is now in the process of doubling in size, with a new traveler's garden associated with the Woodland Garden. So this will indeed be part and parcel to the woodland as people come. So we are taking advantage of the full 15 acres now, after Herrenswood began in 1987. Here in 2021, we are expanding considerably and doing some very exciting projects. So I hope any of you who come to visit the Pacific Northwest will come to see what is happening here, because there's a lot of momentum happening. And this is just some scenes from the springtime in the woodland. Podophyllum delavei, Cypripedium formosanum, Pleone, Pleone praecox, and Paris tibetica off to the right. A sampling of the really cool plants that have been assembled in this particular site. As already noted in in 2012. Take that back. In 2014, the property was purchased at auction by the Port Gamble S Klallam. It was erected a welcome pole on that year by a tribal member, Brian Perry. And if you'll note, in the characterizations in a North Coast Indian style, in the pole is a heron and a frog. So the two characters always found on the cover of a Herrenswood catalog. So I'm really glad to see that carry on in this pole that currently welcomes people into the garden. Some new parts of Herrenswood, including Hawashii, which is the closest we could come in the Salish language to rebirth or new growth, Hawashii. We're calling it the Renaissance Garden, and it's a 2-acre stumpery. All of the stumps that you can see here have been brought in, but we've retained all of the second growth cedar trees. So in Renaissance, we're looking at the renaissance of the forest, the regrowth of the forest, the rebirth of the S Klallam culture, and the rebirth of Heronswood at the same time. It's a pretty awesome place now to visit. It's only 3 years old, but already the plants are growing together, showcasing ferns and their fern allies, but also have a lot of other really pretty interesting plants mixed in. We have the world's largest fern table. We're just picking that bragging right out of thin air because we don't know where the world's longest fern table might exist. But what I'm using this image to illustrate is that in the Hawashii or Renaissance Garden, what we're trying to evoke is an old logging camp that has been reclaimed by nature. The fern table being an old mess hall table. The reason behind this is it illustrates a small slice of the S Klallam history, as they were the primary employee base of a nearby logging mill that they used to row their boats and paddle their canoes over to in morning to go to work, and then in reverse in the evening back to their reservation. So we have an old logging camp that has been reclaimed by nature. As we go forward, more and more accoutrement from old logging camps will be provided to this space by people who no longer want them. It will become a bit of a museum of what a logging camp might have looked like at the turn of the last century. So moving on to Wynncliffe. Wynncliffe sits in the midst of another Indian reservation, one of 3 tribes that are extant on the Kitsap Peninsula. We have the Skokomish to the south, the S Klallam to the west, and the Suquamish to the east. And Wynncliffe sits on an original allotment provided to the Suquamish tribe after the US government burned their longhouse, their community, down in the late 1800s. The US government did not want the Squamish living communally and insisted that they live like we do on separate pieces of land. So every tribal member was given an allotment. The longhouse was burned down, and Wynncliffe sits on one of the allotments, the original allotments. So we are within the Hansville Indian Reservation that encompasses the Suquamish tribe. When we took possession of the property in the year 2000, on the same year that we had sold Heronswood, it was nothing but mown turf, 6.5 acres with a house. And I take with it one of the major lessons that I learned at Heronswood, that of the importance of foliage. So Heronswood is where I learned all these lessons after repeatedly killing, massacring plant combinations, doing things backwards. I was able to garner those lessons and to carry them forward to Wycliffe. And one of those lessons is, of course, the importance of foliage and how foliage does carry any scene in the garden forward, devoid of the distractions of color. Foliage is what does it for us. I think illustrated in these two images with the chromas removed by the miracles of technology. This is how we started, by planting in raw turf that had been removed. I planted in the existing soils, rocky, well-draining soils, and marched across the 6.5 acres, creating scenes to, I think, evoke a bit of nature. A totally different gardening style than what I had at Heronswood. At Heronswood, following the passions of the time, the double mixed borders that were so prevalent both in Europe, especially England, and certainly the Pacific Northwest at that time. I have to say that I was inspired greatly by gardens in the UK, including the garden of Derek Jarman, Prospect Cottage, not far from Great Dixter. That was an inspiration for the house that we built. These gardens did direct me as I put together Wycliffe. We have a fire pit right on the bluff edge. These are all from rocks that come from down below our bluff, 200 feet down. And they were put together by Jeffrey Bale, a mosaic artist from Portland. He put these rocks together to celebrate the world's largest species of octopus that live off of our bluff, the Pacific octopus. And he oriented the arms of the octopus to cardinal points, as well as the solstice sunrise and the solstice sunset. So 6 of those 8 octopus arms are doing a business other than just being and celebrating its ecosystem that is quite still intact down below our bluff. With Mount Rainier rising off in the distance, you can see downtown Seattle, the skyline of downtown Seattle slightly to the left of Mount Rainier. So it gives you an idea, perhaps geographically, where we live. No question that grasses became important to me in the use of grasses, and agapanthus as well. As agapanthus was growing on this site when I took possession of it, 2 women gardened here for 20 years. Before we took possession, they had a small patch of agapanthus and they were happy. So obviously I followed the route of those plants that were content there and have taken it up to a new step. And in 2013, Robert and I were legally married. Our wedding guests on that day were all given labels. They were allowed to go out into the garden and put their name on that label next to their favorite agapanthus, and hence we have named those agapanthus after those guests. So we have a lot of, we call them the Strong Women of Wycliffe series, a lot of women's names associated with some very good agapanthus in the garden as well. We put in a water feature to evoke, bring the evocation of the Puget Sound in the distance. That's, this was a dry piece of land, but with pretty devoid of life, but we brought water up to the house, not only to provide the sense of the Puget Sound, but the reflection of the water, of the sky, and to provide an invitation to life, whether that be through bird life, through amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. We have otter that come into this pond, a huge population of the Pacific chorus frogs, deafening in March and April each year. A good population of salamanders. And of course, birds come to bathe in and drink from the pools, rills, and falls that encircle the house. And of course, the plants that I can grow at Wynncliffe that we cannot successfully grow at Heronswood, only 9 miles away. So that gives you an idea of what a south-facing piece of land can do. That drains cold air off. So this has provided me an opportunity to grow a lot of sun-loving plants, drought-tolerant plants that I was never really able to delve into to the degree I wanted to at the garden. And of course, the number of birds that have come, I think a nod of approbation for any gardeners around the world. If what you create is an invitation to other creatures, then I think that's a pretty good nod that you're doing something right. This is our population of honest hummingbirds that stay the winter at Wynncliffe. We've invited them to stay by what we've planted, so we feel responsible for them when things go south in terms of an Arctic outbreak. And so we keep heated lamps on sugar feeders, and they come in swarms to feed to make it through those Arctic blasts. Incidentally, they are nesting at the same time. They nest in February, so very important. Because of 2 dogs, we've lifted a lot of our rarities off of the walls, off of the ground plane up into walls of containers. We love this process. And this is what these walls look like after fully planted. And this has been successful enough for us that we've continued this in other parts of the garden as well. Terribly sorry about my voice as it exists today. So I hope it's not too annoying. We're just about there. And going back to my collection work, Robert and I continue to have a small nursery at Wynncliffe. I continue to travel. Wings clipped certainly during the last 2 years, but I've been making up for it by looking at plants in the Pacific Northwest. But here's my last trip to the Arunachal Pradesh in Northeast India, looking at begonia, a new begonia species in cultivation, now Begonia Silitensis. Here it is in cultivation. You can see rather large. I'm going to go back to, excuse me about that. The size of it, it's blossoming right now, right at ground level. It smells like gardenias, but I don't have a picture of it. Sorry, you have to tune in when we do a close-up of some of these plants for your program. Through this program later in the early months of 2022, I'll be back again so we can look at some of these plants. Finishing with another part of Wynncliffe, creating a meadow. We were blessed to come to inherit this large stand of Erythronium revolutum, our native lowland fawn lily. But I've taken it to a new level, expanding that stand, creating those Dixter-esque meadows that have inspired me over the years, but visiting Christopher Lloyd, Fergus Garrett, and other keen gardeners in the UK, and turning 2.5 acres of Wynncliffe into a meadow. Here it is in blossom with the Camasias in May. Always a learning process. And throughout the garden, artwork as well. just a new installation of ceramic pieces by Dustin Gimbel. These have just been up a month now. We call them the Phlomis Towers, arising out of the agapanthus. So finishing with the prayer flags that we erected the first year we were at Wycliffe, inspired by my travels in areas of the Buddhist faith. Prayer flags having the prayers of compassion on them that are meant to be activated by the winds, carried across the world to all sentient creatures. I think this world is in need of a good number of prayers at the moment. This concludes my very short, hopefully not too long, gravelly voiced synopsis of what's been happening in my life. So I thank you for the time, and I'll turn it back to you, Noel.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. That was fantastic. Yeah. So having only, not been up to, I think we only managed to get to Heronswood twice. This is wonderful to see. Wycliffe, I had a good tour around Wycliffe, didn't I, a few years ago? Perhaps an inclement time of year. No, fabulous to see those images. Wow, those begonia leaves. Gosh, I thought it was a ligularia at first, and a big one at that. I don't think we've got any questions.
We have got a couple of questions. We have.
Yeah.
Are there any plans, Dan, for the catalogues to be digitalized or written up at all?
You know, that project has never been discussed. We've talked about publishing the essays that were in them into a booklet, but we have not talked about digitalization of the entire catalog. We refer to them a good deal, you know, because the Herrenswood was shuttered for 6 full years, and a lot of the plants taken by the owner and moved away. Regaining the inventory as we knew it was pretty hard, and the catalogs came into extensive use in the process of putting our database back together. So we still refer to them on a considerable basis. But the archives belong to the Port Gamble S Klallam tribe now, not to me. And ultimately, when we have the time and the funds, we'll certainly probably discuss having those digitalized.
Okay. And there's another question. Do you work off any master plans, or, you know, drawn or CAD plans, or do you literally kind of work on the ground on the hoof, as it were, when you're designing the planting plans?
Always on the hoof, you know, like all of us, most of us, I would say. I hope I'm not stepping on anyone's toes by saying that, but you know, I am the student of walking around the garden with a 4-inch pot under my arm, looking for that perfect place to plant it, and generally have not only the 4-inch pot of a plant under my arm at the end of the day, but I have succeeded in digging up 3 plants that weren't in the right place, and now I'm carrying those around as well. So, yeah, it has been by trial and error, planting them where I hoped they would stick, and then always the editing process, which you know, the COVID year gave me amazing opportunities to edit. Because no one was coming, so I have a lot of COVID edits in process right now at Wycliffe in particular.
No, it's been one of the advantages of being stuck still in one place. So are those begonias the largest begonia species, or do they get larger than that? Because they were phenomenal.
Yeah, that species is believed to be the largest leaved species. It comes from an area not very well explored, and I put that name up there as Silitensis. That's affinity still at this point in time, and now there's continued argument. It appears as if Frank Kingdon Ward collected that species in the early years of the 20th century, and it was never adequately described or scientifically described. So we're not really certain. There's got to be further work done between the Indian botanists and Kew, and Edinburgh, I think, is particularly interested in that. So as far as I know, that is the largest leaved of any begonia. But,
right,
you know,
right, yeah.
I throw something like that out and someone's going to say, I have a 10-foot one at home. So
Yeah. And if anybody wants to, you know, Dan has various books, but I can thoroughly recommend this book. Dan, you know, it makes fantastic reading. And so, yeah. And as Dan said, we're going to have you back in the new year to do a webinar. So we're really looking forward to that. That will be wonderful. And let's hope we're all in a slightly better place
Yes,
world-wise.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. That was brilliant.
It was
Really,
absolutely fantastic.
yeah,
And
really
there's a
well,
there's
thank you so much. And thank you for the good questions to both of you. And for everyone who tuned in. Just know that Herrenswood is open Monday through Sunday if you're here. And if you play your cards right on Thursdays and Saturdays, as things exist now due to COVID, you can also come to Wincliffe on Thursdays and Saturdays. So if it's a twofer, and a good day to come over and across on the ferry and visit both gardens. And we're only 9 miles apart, so pretty darn easy.
So those of us sitting here in Europe are thinking, yeah, when are we going to get to do this?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's going to be definitely high on the list, very high on the list. It's been wonderful. There's lots of fantastic comments, Dan, and we'll send you a copy of them because there's some beautiful comments. But also a few people have said how lovely to see the relationship between the two gardens as well. So yeah, really, really good. Fantastic to hear the story and lovely to see you. And take care over the next few weeks, and let's hope we all get out to visit you soon, and that you come over here. I mean, you know, yeah, be nice to see you on this side of the pond too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lovely.
May our paths cross soon, and everyone stay well.
Absolutely.
Until that point.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. That's been fantastic. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And don't forget to look at the diary page, because there's free talks, there's pay to view talks, there are webinars, and there are live events for all of you who are marooned on Plague Island. So, you know, we'll keep you happy. We'll keep you happy.
I love that, Plague Island.
All
okay,
right.
So long, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care,
Thank you
Dan.
so much,
Thanks
Dan.
very
Thank
much.
you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.